Hello and welcome to the launch of Fermaid C for cider, and it's being most appropriately done on World Cider Day. So it's a great day to celebrate something to do with cider besides drinking it, but that will come in due course. This reflects our Lallemand's growing enthusiasm for cider, a product which has many different facets. It's not easy to pull these different facets together. And try to do a one-size-fits-all presentation in terms of what is cider. But these different angles will allow us to look at cider more thoroughly in the years to come. So that's one of the fascinating things with cider, I think, is looking at these different elements that bring us together into what makes us passionate about cider. Today we're going to focus very much on some work done together with friends, colleagues, and clients around the world in the last year or so. My hope today is to first and foremost to try and pull together some of the knowledge that we have gained and also some of the knowledge we already have and try and blend those all together to make an interesting hour for you in the next little while. But I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and you will meet some of them in the next 45 minutes, and it helps us to try and piece all these together with all the different perspectives and research that we've done. First, it gives me great pleasure to bring Gabe Cook into the conversation. Gabe is a relentless advocate and educator for cider, and he hardly needs a very long-winded introduction. Welcome to the Ciderologist himself.
Super. Thank you very much, Sigrid. Really appreciate the intro, and welcome to everybody who's watching, hopefully all over the world. And, you know, that's very appropriate because, as Sigrid said, today is World Cider Day. Cheers to you all, or cheers in whichever language you're speaking in. So, Prost or Tervesex if you're watching in Estonia, or Wassail if you're here in England. Hopefully, you'll be joining me for a glass or two. And it is very apt that we're here on World Cider Day because cider is undergoing the most amazing global revolution. Between 2014 and 2019, it was the world's fastest growing drinks category. Bigger than beer, bigger than spirits, considerably faster than beer as well. And it's not just in the sort of classic Western European area where this is undertaking, where the old heritage of cider making is. It's happening all over the world, in North America, in Australasia, in Africa, in Eastern Europe. Fantastic places and spaces of growth. It really is the most exciting time for cider. Larger cider makers are increasing their volumes, increasing the number of brands they're getting into the marketplace. The number of smaller producers with a closer link to the ground and terroir and trying to express their own story, a sense of place. It's really, there's no better time for a consumer to try and explore the wonderful world of cider. But at the same time, you know, there is a dearth of applied cider research in the way that beers and wines and spirits have very strong current research programs, and historically so too. In fact, the UK used to have its own research facility, the National Cider and Fruit Institute, but that closed for research in 1986. So we in the UK, the world's largest cider category, has not had any publicly published research in that time. Now, I know that other places around the world have picked up the mantle of that research, and it's beginning to start, but it takes somebody like Lallemand to grasp the opportunity and to drive it from the industry perspective, which is why I'm really excited to be here today and to be undertaking work with Lallemand to help them champion cider, because ultimately that's what I'm passionate about, and that's what's important to me, the understanding and the opportunity of what cider can be and what cider can afford for the consumer. There is so much more opportunity for growth. And so Lallemand have been really driving from the front for the last handful of years, I would say, in terms of the creation of these bespoke products, in terms of the time, the effort, the research, the trials, the sponsorship of events, the turning up to events to speak to cider makers, to give them that knowledge and that understanding of the importance of yeast and nutrients, regardless of what type or size or scale or ideology having an understanding of what the importance of yeast and nutrient is, and then coming along the journey. So it's days like today that are really exciting, and these are the next steps in terms of Cider's great adventure, and I'm really, really looking forward to seeing just what an impact Fermaid C has on the cider category. Go Cider. Cheers. Lam, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm blushing, Gabe. Thank you so much. That's great.
That's just my shirt, very garish. That's what's very bright. Sorry.
It is very bright. Oh, it's fantastic. It is very exciting. Thank you for always injecting us with a little appropriately named a jab of energy of what we are hoping to achieve by doing these collaborations with, in all aspects of Fermaid research and Fermaid, in cider research and in terms of nutrients specifically today. And that's where we're hoping in terms of some of the research we have been doing and some of the research we will be doing, that we're looking at some of the new and exciting things we can bring to the industry. If we come right back to the beginning, if we start what the yeast needs, and that's where our passion is, how that passion with yeast and bacteria and nutrients can join and weave in with our excitement around cider, is looking at what the yeast needs to do to make the best cider possible. And a lot of those aspects come down to some very fundamental properties, and that is in terms of what the yeast needs to thrive. And that, as many of us will have noticed in terms of producing, is some nitrogen. And that's something we speak about a great deal, and that's something we'll be focusing on in terms of nutrition. But there's a lot of other aspects to that. It's not just nitrogen. There's never a lack of a carbon source, at least until the fermentation is finished and the yeast are dying. And that's because there's sugar, and that's where they get their carbon source from. But nitrogen is often one that's talked about because in cider there's not a lot of nitrogen. We'll look at some of these numbers more specifically. But something we don't talk a lot about, and something that is the reason we're here to start that sort of sharing of knowledge and sharing of what we know, is this need for the lipids and oxygen, as well as the vitamins and minerals. All of these things can come together to be able to help the yeast make a better cider. So why have a new product? There is what we call now a Fermaid family. It's not just the Lallemand family, there's the Fermaid family, because even though Lallemand select and produce and package and market yeast and bacteria and nutrients, there is still some elements that evolve over time. And one of those is, for example, the Fermaid family. It started with Fermaid K. I would say Fermaid K has been in the market for 30 or almost 40 years. And has been used in our own facilities in terms of as a yeast producer, that through the different markets, different needs in terms of the legislation, for example, we have different products. So there's Fermaid E in Europe, which has different regulations, and then Fermaid A in Australia. So we have different needs in different markets. Fermaid C is really, of course, taking those considerations into it, but really looking at what is cider, what is that cider matrix. So making sure that it's legal, but also in terms of looking at what the yeast needs in what is a very unique matrix. I think sometimes we've perhaps had the thought that as a fruit, it has perhaps similar needs to, for example, grapes. And grapes, there's a great deal of research that's been done being done in grapes, but not as much as Gabe mentioned in cider. And that's where in doing our research in these last few years, we've seen that there is a need for a nutrient that is much more specifically focused on cider. And that's where we were looking at when we looked at looking at some of these different needs. Very generally, though, there's been an evolution not just in nutrients, but also in terms of looking at the whole evolution of the market. And some of those, if we come back to just the nutrition, initially 30 years ago, many of these recipes, many of these production protocols being used in the cider industry we were just looking to support the yeast to make sure that it doesn't stick, it doesn't stop at the end of the fermentation. But in the last 20, 30 years, those recipes have changed as well in terms of the products being added, but we noticed that there hasn't necessarily been a change in either the addition rates of the yeast or of the nutrients. And that can be an issue because if you're going from, say, expecting a fermentation to reach completion at 8% alcohol, that's quite different from a fermentation that's being expected or hoping to come to 14% alcohol. It's so important for the yeast because those scales of stress points are exponential. So alcohol at 8% and alcohol at 12 or 14% is quite a bit more lethal to the yeast, and that we need to take that into consideration in terms of what we're looking on. So if we look at what nitrogen does 30 years ago, we know that it is important because it has an impact on the uptake of sugar. There's a direct relationship between the amount of nitrogen available to the yeast and the amount of sugar that it can uptake. So it has an impact on the fermentation rate and on the activity of the fermentation. So it has some very critical links to what is being done during a fermentation, during the yeast. If we then look at about 10 years ago, we can see that it's not just nitrogen, it's looking at what is the yeast available nitrogen and how it can use that, and looking at how the importance of the nitrogen source can vary. If we look at diammonium phosphate as a common addition, the ammonia component is quickly utilized by the yeast, but we've also realized that amino acids have a much bigger impact on the fermentation in terms of the overall impact on the ester synthesis, but also on the overall health of the yeast throughout the fermentation. So the organic nitrogen has a tremendous impact on the yeast being able to complete a healthy fermentation. But then as we see in terms of more recently, we see that it's really about a balance. And that's very often in terms of anything in our lives, it is about a balance. And this can be seen in this evolution of looking at not only the organic nitrogen, but looking, as I mentioned before, at the sterols, at the vitamins, at the minerals, and how they all work together to be able to support the yeast through the fermentation. And that's where we've come to the point of looking at Lallemand cider. We've been able to do this because we've been doing many collaborations through the world, and that is what we're here to share with you today. So some of the research is coming from internal laboratories with our research lab in France, in Toulouse. We've also had collaborations with a partner in Tallinn, in Estonia, and that's the Center of Food and Fermentation Technology, but as well as other ones in Australia, in Tasmania, and even in Spain. We have some more practical work being done on some fermentations as well. So this is just the start. We don't have all the answers yet, but hopefully with some of these resources and this core group of collaborators, we'll be able to find out how a cold fermentation in fresh juice, looking for more aromatics in France, is equally important on many levels as a yeast fermenting on concentrate that we're trying to make sure that it can achieve the goals that are needed from that fermentation. One of my partners is my colleague Céline Raynal in France, and Céline has been with Lallemand, since 2001, just the same as me. She's an R&D project leader, and I could not have done this today without her. She sees the details as well as being able to see the big picture, and that's been very helpful as we've started this journey on cider research. So I look very much forward to having her on the next cider project under her capable supervision. And hopefully we can find some more interesting things, and you can join us again in future years as we elaborate on some of that research. Evelyn.
Okay, thank you, Sigrid. So what happens during the fermentation? So to have a fermentation, we need a must, which contains sugar, nitrogen, and micronutrients, as it was said by Sigrid. And we will have a growth of the yeast, and we will obtain a biomass. During the fermentation, the yeast consumes the sugar and produce alcohol and CO2, as you know, but also secondary metabolites like glycerol, acids, aromas, and others. Thank you. In our lab in Toulouse, we have the monitoring of 22 fermenters of 1.1 liter. During the alcoholic fermentation, the CO2 is released and it leads to a loss of weight. We follow this loss of weight with a balance, and thanks to this data, we can calculate the CO2 release to follow the kinetic on the alcoholic fermentation. In the graph, you can see it is the dotted line. We can calculate after the speed of CO2 release, and it's easier to see the different phases on the fermentation. We can see the lag phase, the exponential phase, the stationary phase, and the end of the alcoholic fermentation, as you can see in the graph. Now I will show you an example on alcoholic fermentation done with a synthetic must. A synthetic must mimics a natural grape must, and there was 2 levels of YAN. The YAN, it means yeast assimilable nitrogen, nitrogen content. In red, this is the high nitrogen concentration, and in blue, a lower concentration. We can see that all the nitrogen is consumed before 48 hours on the alcoholic fermentation. And in the same time of the nitrogen consumption, we have the growth of the yeast. The yeast population is higher with high nitrogen. It is the dotted line in red. And there is lower yeast population with low YAN in blue. And we can see that the fermentation duration is longer with low YAN, around 160 hours, and the fermentation takes only 4 days, 96 hours, with higher YAN. So in this case, the only difference was the nitrogen content, and we can see the huge impact on the yeast growth and the fermentation duration. So the nitrogen is key for the alcoholic fermentation. But what are the nitrogen concentration in grape must or in apple juice? So in this first graph, we can see the YAN concentration in grape must. They analyzed around 100 samples of grape must in Languedoc region in France, and we can see that there is a high variability. The concentrations are between 50 and 450 milligrams per liter, with an average at 150 milligrams per liter. The same kind of trials was done in the Eastern United States. It is the next graph. Yes. And then analyze more than 100 samples of apple juice in this case. And the YAN concentration were between 10 and 250 milligrams per liter, with an average only at 59 milligrams per liter. So there is also a high variability. And the YAN content is highly lower in apple juice concentration in comparison with the grape must. And it will be the same with the concentrate of apple juice. There is also lower concentration in comparison with grape must. Now I will share you results obtained during a Lallemand thesis. They studied the impact on vitamins and nitrogen imbalance. They have done alcoholic fermentation with synthetic must with 2 YAN concentrations, low nitrogen and high nitrogens, with vitamins starvation. In the first case, there was a nicotinic acid deficiency. During the alcoholic fermentation, they follow the viability. In the graph, this is the percentage of viability in function of the CO2 produced. In blue, there is high nitrogen and low nicotinic acid, and we can see that there is a yeast mortality around 80 grams per liter of CO2 release. In this case, there is a stuck fermentation due to the cell's death. But in red, there was a lower nitrogen, so low nitrogen and low nicotinic acid, and there is a good maintain on the viability until 105 grams per liter of CO2 release, which is the end of the alcoholic fermentation. The other case is with the pantothenic acid. In this case, there is with high nitrogen and low pantothenic acid, so in blue, we have a quick yeast mortality, and it's not the case with low nitrogen in red. We have a good maintain on the viability in red. So it's important. With high nitrogen and low vitamins content, we have a disequilibrium, and significant yeast mortality is observed, and it leads to stuck fermentation. We analyze in our laboratory of research in Tallinn, in Estonia, 3 concentrates of apple juice. We analyze the 3 amino acids and calculate the YAN coming from this amino acids. We can see again a high variability. The YAN content is higher with C3, and we can know the main amino acid is the asparagine, which represents between 60% and 80%. For our trials, we have done some dilution, and in the first case, the concentrates were diluted in order to have 200 grams per liter of sugar with apple concentrate only, and we obtained a YAN between 24 and 122 milligrams per liter. In the second case, we use also a glucose syrup. 60% of the sugar came from the glucose syrup and 30% come from the apple concentrate. So after the dilution, to have 200 grams per liter of sugar, it means a total alcohol potential around 12%. In this first case, the dilution was around 72%, and it was at 89% in the second case. So after dilution, we had very low nitrogen content. It means there is a YAN deficiency. And it's important to have in mind that it's the same conclusion for the other components, like the vitamins and the micronutrients. With high dilution, we can have several deficiencies. In 2018, we worked on a formulation for the specific nutrient for cider application. Lallemand is producer of yeast, but also specific yeast derivatives. And we have the chance to test a lot of different specific yeast derivatives. So we have done several formulations with ammonium nitrogen and specific yeast derivatives rich in vitamins and minerals. And we tested this formulation with a medium at 200 grams per liter of sugar, 41% coming from apple concentrate, and 59% coming from glucose syrup. In black, this is the yeast without nutrients. And in red, it is the formulation chosen for Fermaid C. And there is also another control, which is Fermaid C in blue. So in this case, there is a strong nutrient effect. We note a significant impact on the maximum speed of CO2 release. It is the end of the exponential phase, so there is a link with the growth of the yeast. And we can see that Fermaid C is more efficient than Fermaid C, and that there is a huge decrease on the fermentation duration. The fermentation takes around 23 days. The fermentation duration, and it is only at 9 days with Fermaid C. So a huge impact on the Fermaid C. And now I would like to present you another trial done also in our lab with similar mediums than previously. We use 3 different yeasts used for cider production. The temperature was controlled at 22 degrees, and we compare a control without nutrient, DAP, and Fermaid C. This graph represents the fermentation duration. We can see a significant decrease on the fermentation time with Fermaid C. Fermaid C use with the 3 yeast. And Fermaid C is better than DAP alone. And for the yeast D, you can see that DAP addition was not efficient, contrary to Fermaid C. The yeast D should be more sensitive to the lack of micronutrients. We had a sluggy fermentation, and it was not the case with Fermaid C. So in this case, we can see the very good impact on Fermaid C in comparison with DAP and also in comparison with the control. So to conclude with my part, I will say some key points. So the nitrogen content modulates the yeast growth and the fermentation duration, of course. Vitamins and nitrogen imbalance lead to yeast mortality, and so it leads to stuck fermentation. There is a high nitrogen content variability in apple juice, but also in concentrate of apple juice. We can have a YAN nitrogen, vitamins and micronutrients deficiency, and it worsens in case of high dilution. Fermaid C formulation was very efficient in our fermentation conditions and better than Fermaid C, and also more efficient than DAP thanks to its formulation with specific yeast derivatives rich in minerals and vitamins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Céline. That's great. With some of this in mind, I perhaps wanted to also give a little bit of an insight with respect to some other aspects to consider. So while we're focusing very much on nutrition, there's also another sort of element I'd like to just slide in a little bit, which is this element of protection, protecting the yeast throughout the fermentation, especially in a fermentation where there's a lot more pressure on it in terms of alcohol, in terms of clarity of the fermentation media. And that's where, in the research we've been doing in these last 2 decades, there's this element of protection being essential. And why would it really be essential? It really comes down to ethanol. It is the yeast's worst enemy. And that's where it can affect the cell membrane. So to be able to maintain the cell membrane fluidity and to be able to protect the internal cell components from the ethanol toxicity, this element of protection comes in. And that's where adding an element of rehydration protection right from when you're rehydrating the yeast is something to consider. If we consider that oxygen, if an addition of oxygen is added, it enables the yeast to produce some of these sterols that are really important to avoiding cell death. But that's not the only element that is always practical to be able to integrate into a production procedure. So having the ability to add oxygen in the middle of the fermentation, which is when it is optimal to be able to help the yeast, is not always helpful. But making sure the yeast has enough vitamins and minerals, not only during the fermentation, but through this addition in the rehydration, can really benefit the yeast. And you can see in this aspect, in this example, where we are comparing, in this case, a Chardonnay, and I use this example as being sort of a white, sometimes clarified product that can sometimes lack some of these essential elements that are called survival factors or sterols, and showing the difference between adding a rehydration nutrient versus an oxygenation during the middle of the fermentation, and seeing that this benefit of having more protection from the beginning is not only given to the mother cell at the start of the fermentation, but is transferred to the daughter cells. And this end of fermentation curve that you see in the upper left-hand side is showing that impact on the end of the fermentation. So an addition at the beginning of the fermentation of a rehydration nutrient, a rehydration protectant, is able to impact the end of the fermentation when it's becoming quite critical in terms of ethanol toxicity and lacking perhaps some other elements. So it, in many ways, is as important, or if not more important, to consider as in terms of oxygen versus a protectant. And what are these survival factors? They're really critical in terms of being able to maintain that cell membrane viability and vitality throughout the fermentation. So it's helping the yeast to be more robust throughout the fermentation. I'd like to give a very small example. It's very simplistic. If you're interested, we can certainly come back and give you more details. But just as an example of looking at a recipe with a customer where we were trying to see if this protectant would have an impact, looking at the different recipes, in this case was a different concentration, a different addition rate of the concentrate, apple concentrate, where we were trying to change one element at a time. So with one recipe, we got a final alcohol of 7.9, whereas another recipe definitely had a stronger finishing alcohol. But certainly if we look at the impact of the rehydration protectant, then you can see that there was an impact with just that element as being a difference. Then I would like to look, that was just sort of a little bit of a side streak into protection, something to keep in mind if you're looking at some of the differences to become more efficient in a fermentation. We were going to have a colleague, Caspar, but he couldn't join us today, and I've had the pleasure, immense pleasure, of introducing Evelyn Bartowsky, joining us from Lallemand, Australia, which is great because we have some people from Australia joining us today as well. Evelyn is an esteemed researcher, formerly with the AWRI and luckily with Lallemand now, and is equally comfortable presenting to an Austrian crowd as much as she is helping Australian cider and winemakers as well. So thank you for helping us today, Evelyn.
You're very welcome. So if we come back to nutrition, we've already seen how important it is to have sufficient nitrogen or nutrition or YAN, and we know that yeast need both the inorganic nitrogen or the DAP or the ammonia particularly, and also the organic nitrogen, which we've talked about as being those amino acids. So here in this graph, we're looking into DAP versus a balanced nitrogen source, Fermaid C, with low and high YAN. Although we were trying to match the YAN levels of the control in this example, we did fall short a little bit of the organic component of Fermaid C, as it wasn't as precise as DAP. However, if we look at these two, this graph here, we can see that, so just to go back, sorry, the DAP is the red graph here, and the Fermaid C with 2 levels of YAN are the light and blue graphs here. So what we can see in this is that less YAN does not actually mean less effective, and nor that DAP did not mean that it is more optimal. So we can see in the red graph here as well, where the DAP was being used, the inorganic nitrogen alone, that there's actually a high amount of remaining nitrogen, which in the overall fermentation is probably not ideal, because having residual nitrogen, their nutrients, are also available for contaminants or spoilage microbes, which of course we don't want to have. So if we then have a look at the fermentation kinetics, what we have here in this graph is looking at fermentation rate. So the inorganic, or the DAP, is shown in the yellow and orange with low and high nitrogen respectively, and we also have the balanced nutrition with inorganic and organic, the Fermaid C, and that's shown in light and dark blue, with low and high yan again respectively. And what we can see here is that the balanced nutritions, the Fermaid C, the ones in blue, actually have a higher fermentation rate. And you can see that visually on the graph here as the highest peaks at day 2. So how does this translate into ethanol production? So if we have a look here on this graph, again, the colour scheme is the same. We have the Fermaid C is the blue, light and dark, and we have the DAP in low and high nitrogen in yellow and orange. And what we can see is that there's more efficient ethanol production with the complex nutrient, which has both the inorganic and the organic. And in fact, we can see that the target ethanol concentration is actually reached a lot faster with the Fermaid C, the complex nutrient. So this is reflective of the more efficient fermentation kinetics that we saw in the previous graph, again highlighting the importance of having a balanced nutrition. So understanding the kinetics and such, we also know that they're looking at sugar consumption. We also know that there's differences between yeast strains in both their fermentation kinetics, but also in their aroma production. So here I'm illustrating with 3 different yeast strains, so on the left, the middle, and on the right, fermenting in the same apple juice, but with 3 different nutrient regimes. So we have in blue the control, which is no nutrient addition. The inorganic nutrient is the DAP in orange, and Fermaid C, we can see the balanced nutrition in grey. And so having a look at this graph here, which is the consumption of sugar, we can see that there's more sugar consumption shown in the graphs as less sugar is remaining after about 9 days with the balanced nutrition. So with the grey graphs, you can see they're much lower. So we've had a much more sugar being consumed, less remaining. We can also see that there's differences between the 3 yeast strains in their consumption. So sugar utilisation is better with a complete yeast nutrient, again highlighting the importance of having a balanced nutrition. So the last example that I'd just like to talk about briefly or show you is the type of nutrient has a very specific impact on the biosynthesis of aroma compounds. Even though we look at many, many different aroma compounds, I'm just going to illustrate it here today with one compound, the isoamyl acetate, which I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. It's an ester that gives you a banana flavour or pear and such. So we've discussed the impact of the type of nutrient on the fermentation kinetics and sugar consumption, but we also know that yeast strains impact the sensory qualities. So what we can see here are 2 different yeast strains with 4 different nutrient regimes, and what we have here is the control in green, and then 3 different nutrients being added to the fermentation, and we can see the production, the concentration. I guess firstly you can see there's a difference between the 2 yeast strains. So one yeast strain is all the solid lines and a second strain is the dotted lines. So you can see the amount of isoamyl acetate differs, but we can also see the importance of a nutrient addition in the production of this ester, as you can see the orange, blue and pink concentrations are much higher than the control where there was no nutrient added. So hopefully we've seen that balanced nutrition is very important both for the kinetics, the sugar consumption, and also the ethanol production, but not forgetting the importance of the biosynthesis of aroma compounds as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Evelyn. It really does bring us in a little bit of a overall view of what these different elements are to be able to produce a lovely cider in terms of nutrients, but also in terms of esters. And that is, there's so many other compounds that could have been brought in as an example, but we just thought this one illustrated it so well that this is one of the examples. And it brings us to our next presenter, who is Lorenza, joining us from Italy in the Laimburg Nature and Science Institute in northern Italy. And we also, as we've seen these different effects, I think it's important, even if we look at efficiency, and it's also to remember that there are these elements that we're looking for in terms of the sensory and how that impacts. So even if we're looking at some of the practical aspects and some of the aspects that can drive many production facilities, it is so important to remember that this balanced nutrition will also have an impact on the sensory profile. And whether it's a question of avoiding H2S or other off aromas, but also in terms of enhancing what the apple juice and the apple concentrate is able to offer us in terms of an interesting and a complex sensory profile. And I think that's a whole world that will open to us as we start to dig into what those aromas are and how they can be better elaborated during the course of the fermentation. So Lorenza, if you wanted to touch on some of the some of the very important aspects of sensory impact that the fermentations can have in cider and the impact of nutrition. Hopefully your sound is working. There we go.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Great, thank you.
Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
And good afternoon also from South Tyrol. Just a little picture from the site where I'm working, which is a small area from the northeast of Italy, which has been working for not a great amount in terms of quantity, but has been expanding the world of producing cider, even if sometimes at small scale, but because the dessert apple are the main crop in this area, the cider has been made and it's becoming more and more important in the area. And so thank you for allowing me to show this little result we have been getting from our trial, which was performed in a 10-liter volume that in a room where the temperature was controlled. We used EC 1118 as a yeast, and we use also different kind of juice, fresh apple juice from 3 varieties of dessert apple, and 2 different kind of concentrate. One concentrate was obtained in a, like, as we can call dessert apple style, so not changing the sugar concentration. And the other one, that is C2, we increased the sugar concentration up to 22 brix, and also added some malic acid to increase the acidity. In this trial that was performed in triplicate, we have been comparing the effect of nutrition from Fermaid C used at 25 grams per hectoliter at the inoculum, and compared with the control, which was the juice or the concentrate with no nutrient addition, so leaving just what naturally came from the apples or the concentrate by itself. And we also decided to compare it with the use of GoFirm or without the use of GoFirm. So whenever you have seen the plus sign, that's where we have been also rehydrated the yeast with GoFirm, and if not, we just didn't use it at the time of rehydration. I divided the effect on the fermentation time in this gray area because in this case we have only 12 and 16 weeks that as an average between the juice and the concentrate, and so the amount of potential ethanol was around 8%, and we didn't expect a lot of stress from the yeast. And so we have been seeing that according to the apple juice and also according to some addition of nutrition, we have some privilege in fermenting this juice and producing cider in a time that was about from 5 days to 9 days to just totally complete the fermentation. But all the fermentation were completed successfully. A bigger difference we have been seeing, as also expected, when we fermented C2, which was the concentrate where the Brix concentration was much higher, so in about 13 degrees of alcohol as a potential. And so we have been noticing that in this case, Fermaid C made a difference of about 1 week, and so the fermentation completed earlier. And 1 week is also a quite good amount of time and a good privilege. We have been noticing that such an advantage was not so great when we have been using GoFirm in rehydration, neither in the control or in the juice fermented by after Fermaid C addition. And for sure, we see a great disadvantage of not using anything and just leaving everything was in the juice, or better in the concentrate, which completed the fermentation in about 21 days, which is quite long. And also, I've said that we did the trial in triplicate, so in some of the flask we have been noticing a little bit of more residual sugar, even if the average we got a dry cider. The aim of this work were more oriented in looking at the sensory impact, and we have been noticing and measuring that by measuring the volatile organic components such as alcohol, esters, acids, and other derivatives that were capable to be analyzed with a specific method for the cider set up in our area for the gas chromatography detection of these volatile components. I just put here an example, and so we have been seeing in this case the main sensory impact was related to the apple variety. We have seen here only 2 of them, but as we can see, we see the variety S1 has a much higher amount of volatile component from alcohols, a little bit of esters, which are the green bars, and a little bit of some phenol derivatives. So even when we added the nutrient, we have seen a little higher amount of alcohols, but in this case, the sensory impact was not much affected. If we observe the other variety, which is S3, we can see a greater amount of ethyl esters. And we assume that this greater amount was produced in relation to what was the original juice composition, because these were dessert apple from a local variety, and we have been noticing the great difference between those 2 varieties. So in this case, most likely the dessert apple has the bigger impact and the bigger influence. But when we have been looking at this concentrate, we have been seeing initially a picture that sounded to be about the same. If we see the other, okay, perfect. And in this case, it seems also that the two concentrate have, one is 14 Brix, the other 22 Brix at the beginning, and we have been noticing a little difference in, especially related to the quantity of esters as a sum that were detected at the end of fermentation, and also a little bit higher amount of alcohol. Like for the other component, like acid and phenol derivatives, we didn't see a great difference between the different ciders. We can see in, we can also read that as the influence of the higher amount of potential, or higher amount of sugars and alcohol, so a longer fermentation time that was represented in a higher amount of ethyl esters in general. However, we started to see from this picture a little difference between what we see in Fermaid when we added Fermaid C and Fermaid in comparison to the control. And this difference was magnified when we are observing other compounds. So these compounds were represented in a different chart because they were synthesized or present in the cider in a slightly smaller amount. But we know that flavor components sometimes have a greater impact even if they are a smaller amount. So in this case, where we don't have absolute quantity, but only units that were used to compare the different ciders, we can see a bigger difference between those cider produced in concentrate, using concentrate, when we added Fermaid C. And this pattern was observed even when we have a smaller amount of potential in alcohol. So the concentrate number 1 with 14 Brix has much more phenylethyl esters, those esters in general related to flavor of tropical rose, so with some impact that people might like it or not, but has an impact on the final flavor. And we observed that both in the higher concentration, in the concentrate with much sugar, but also in the one with the smaller amount of sugars. So even if this is a small trial, we can say that that nutrition, as we also been hearing from other description and from other experts, can help to shape the flavor in your product, and will be only through trials with different product that people can achieve the profile that is the more likable for his own product and maybe to characterize it. So these are just those small results from what we have been noticing, and I thank you for again for allowing me to present those results, hoping that might help you in whatever is your production and whatever is your cider style.
Thank you so much, Lorenza. It's a fascinating story with what's happening in terms of the Tyrol area and the organic supply of almost all of Europe in terms of eating apples, and that whole sort of pride in the orchards in that area. So it's very fascinating to see how that's evolving, and how you can bring some of this research that you've done with us also on a practical level to some local producers as well. So I hope that can benefit us all in the long run. That is a little bit of what we were hoping to bring up to you today in terms of some of the research we've been looking at, some of the work we've done, both in terms of applied research within some laboratories, but also with some practical research with some clients, and we hope to continue that. It was really just a chance to try and to pull all these threads in, and hopefully give some of that back to the industry in terms of seeing where we can go in the next step, and what is that next step. And that's where I might bring in Kieron Atkinson, who is working as the consultant to Murphy and Son in England, and he is also a wine producer and a cider producer. More importantly, though I have yet to try your cider, Kieron. And also, perhaps if Gabe wants to jump in, perhaps some comments on what you've been listening to, and perhaps see where we can, as Lallemand, can help the industry in the years to come. So if you wanted to jump in, that would be great.
Yeah. Thank you, Sigrid. Some really interesting presentations. I think what most struck me about Fermaid C really was the efficiency, the gained efficiencies that as a producer one is going to get with the use of Fermaid C. And then on top of that, as well as efficiency, which obviously is important to the audience we've got today as a craft maker, to combine those efficiencies with increased esters, increased aromas, increased flavors. I think that really opens up what Gabe has been saying for a long time, and what obviously cider drinkers have been aware of for a long time, that there's so much more and so many flavors within the apple that can be released through correct procedure. And I think often with the smaller guys, it sometimes feels as if there's a little bit of, not necessarily of luck, but there feels almost a kind of there's some processes that really could be improved. And I think that with the Fermaid C product especially, and with the enhanced use of nutrition that goes along with the fermentation, that obviously will lead to an improved product, which I hope will see the cider industry largely mirroring, as it has done in America, with releasing of new flavors, which and different styles of cider, so that in the same way that when one thinks of different grape varieties, there are it's associated with different flavors. I think right now, as an industry, I think people buy cider. They don't go out and buy Dabinett, or they don't go out and buy Spartan or Michelin or any of those. Whereas actually there's a great opportunity here to go a lot more single varieties, more flavors. Basically, I don't want to kind of over egg it, but more, I guess, more artistry for the producer, which ultimately leads to more fun for them, leads to a better product for the consumer, and leads to a more vibrant, I think, industry of lots more people entering, because there is certainly not a shortage of apples. And so exciting times. And so thank you very much for today's presentations.
Thank you, Kieron. Yeah, I think that's, as we look, I started perhaps by saying there are so many facets to cider. It's trying to find which facet to start with. And in this case, we're looking more at perhaps where the yeast has to be pushed a little bit more to its limit. Certainly, our hope is that in the next little while, with this information that we're using, a little bit like the Formula One cars, there's the technology that trickles down to the everyday cars and improves our daily lives. I'm hoping that some of this research will also help us with some of the fermentations, perhaps more in craft cider, in terms of understanding what the yeast needs. Even if there's less alcohol in a craft cider, that there's still that need for a complete nutrition that will help the yeast perhaps perform differently in terms of aromatic contribution. So yeah, that's some interesting comments in terms of what we're looking for and where we want to be. Perhaps Gabe, you've perhaps had some thoughts with you've been squirreling away on your book, is where is the industry going in the next few years in terms of what we are able to contribute of different types of ciders, and going into a pub even, or a bar in the US, and not just having to order a cider. Where you at?
Well, I think it all comes back to what Kieron alluded to there, and which Lorenza, Evelyn, and Céline, and yourself have all talked about, is the fact that there is this incredible diversity and range of different types of sensory characters that exist within apples, potentially as much as there is within grapes. but crucially that grapes and apples are not the same thing. They are different, and that although from a broader perspective, cider, consumers don't really know what a cider is. It looks a bit more like a beer. It's made a bit more like a wine. But really crucially, what I think is starting to shine through is that cider is cider. It is an entirely unique, idiosyncratic, special, amazing drink that deserves to have as much respect and research pumped into it as any of those other drinks. Cider in the UK alone is worth £3.1 billion. This is not a small industry. And there is still largely, I think, an approach from the makers, biggest to smallest, of some small c conservatism. They've undertaken what they have undertaken for the last 30 kind of years, making good and clean ciders. Well, now the consumer wants more than that. They want to have range and diversity. And one of the ways to achieve that is, as Lorenza was alluding to, was around the unique impact of specific apple varieties, whether they be more sort of acid-driven, classic dessert or culinary apples, whether they be more tannic-driven, those more classic to the western parts of England and northern parts of Europe, and what kind of scale of maker you are. There are some small producers just who, from a fundamental ideological point of view, don't want to do anything to their cider for it to be an expression of their place, and that's absolutely fine, and it makes some amazing ciders. But there are also people who want to use high quantities of that raw material, of that juice, and to be really expressive, but for it to be clean and really accessible, and a really enjoyable experience. And this is where the likes of Fermaid C and also the multiple range of different yeast that Lallemand sort of provides to extract different characters, whether it be to reduce the acidity, to improve the mouthfeel and the texture, to enhance those aromatic characteristics. Now is the time for the cider makers to go sort of one step beyond and to grasp this opportunity to showcase this myriad diversity of different types of ciders, to tap into these consumers who want to know more. And looking into the future, that's what's going to happen. If cider is going to grow breadthways as a category, this diversity has to be achieved so that the drinkers, so the trade and the drinkers know that they exist, so that it can then be demanded, and therefore it becomes a permanent position in retail, in the supermarket, or on the pub. As you said, wouldn't it be great to go down the pub? Wouldn't be great to go down the pub, full stop. But to go down the pub and to have a pint of lovely sort of, really lean, minery, crisp, fresh, acid-driven cider, a slightly off-dry, really aromatic, fruity, a perry, maybe a bone-dry, earthy, tannic cider, still, a co-fermentation with some other fruits in the fridge. All of these things are now happening, just on small scale, and just getting that broader awareness and appreciation is just, it's absolutely amazing. And it's going to go two ways. There's this globalization of cider as events like this and more consumer events talking about ciders being made all around the world and how they differentiate from the fruit that's used, from the broader mindset. Somebody like our Australian and New Zealand friends who are hopefully watching this, they don't come with the sort of some of the baggage or the sort of the historical context that we have here in the UK, for better or for worse. It's just different. It comes from a very different mindset, often from that strong winemaking perspective, and so the interest in extracting these kind of unique characters. So you've got that globalization effect, but you've also got the very strong localized effect as well, about that expression of unique place of the varieties and of the fruit, and trying to tease that out once again in multiple different ways. So just like what Kieron was saying, is that products like this start with enabling producers to be more efficient and to save money, which has got to be a good thing, of course. But it starts this journey of diversification so that we can get beyond cider being just cider and being treated with the same degree of range, portfolio, and diversity of flavors and styles that beers and wines have. And to that, I will say cheers.
Just I want to pick something up that you just said, Gabe, as well. I think where we can really add, where this could be really added to, it's not just pubs and bars. And I think a huge section will be getting sommeliers involved, getting restaurants involved, because actually you've got a product there. Certainly, country that produces apples very easily, where you have a wide array of flavors, a wide array of aromas. You have a consumer population who is comfortable and doesn't have to overthink the product, and many restaurants that want something maybe lower alcohol, maybe something more local. It's just a great opportunity, I think, obviously for the UK, but for the world. Without being kind of too hyperbolic, in regards to what cider can achieve, because it's not just drink it by the pint, it's drink it by the kind of wine glass size. I think it's kind of, that's where, I think it's a very interesting time, very exciting time.
Yeah, it's. I think what's really crucial is that it's not a case of drinking the cider by a pint as being wrong and by the wine glass being right, or having it at 4.5 ABV versus 8%. It's not about right or wrong. It's about just showcasing that diversity. I use the phrase that there is a cider for everybody on every occasion. There's nothing better than that 4.5, 5% ABV cider on a warm summer's day that we've kind of got here in the UK. That refreshing pint, amazing. We know that's a great thing that cider can do. But it can also be the really big, tannic, bold, earthy drink that you swill in your brandy glass by the fireside in the middle of winter. It can be something that you make in the the method traditionnelle, and you have and you pop and you celebrate with. It can be something really lean and fresh and minerally that you would have with some seafood. It can be something big and savory that you would have with meat or mushrooms. It can do all of those things. It's not the one thing, and that's the big thing.
Fantastic. I was going to add some words to end, but I don't think between Gabe and Kieron I could add anything better. So I think thank you to all of you, to Céline, to Evelyn, Lorenza, and especially all the research that's gone behind it, the teams that we don't have presenting in front of us. And all I wanted to say perhaps is we want to be a part of that excitement. So we'll look forward to celebrating future World Cider Days and seeing everybody more individually in the future. Thank you, all of you.